Hello, and welcome to Demand Driven Matters, the podcast that addresses all things related to demand driven manufacturing. This is the fifth and final installment in our series, The 5 Key Elements That Drive Flow. Today's topic is aligning your metrics. Our special guest today is John Maher, Vice President of Product Strategy for Synchrono Manufacturing Software. John has over 20 years of experience in various manufacturing environments and with various manufacturing systems, and has been recently named a Pro to Know by a supply and demand chain executive. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Pam.
As we always do, let's just level set by talking a little bit about our definition of demand-driven manufacturing. When we refer to demand-driven manufacturing, we're talking about a synchronized closed loop between customer orders, production scheduling, and manufacturing execution, all while synchronizing the flow of materials and resources across the supply chain. For us, key elements are synchronization and flow, the basis of this podcast series. In previous episodes, we've addressed elements 1 through 4. Today's session, as I mentioned, is all about metrics. So, John, within the context of demand-driven manufacturing and driving production flow, can you talk a little bit about metrics alignment and why this is so critical?
Sure, Pam. Metrics do a lot of things within an organization. One of the things that people would think of is that they give us guidance or kind of a view into what's going on in the organization and whether or not the organization is meeting the level that we expect it to perform at. But they go a lot deeper than that. They really influence behavior, and they can influence it in the right way or the wrong way. And also, within metrics, it's critically important for them to be in alignment from the lowest level metrics up to the highest level metrics, because if they aren't, you will be putting employees within the manufacturing space in constant conflict. And really, when I walk into manufacturers and I see these metrics that conflict, the management normally tells me, well, yeah, we want both of those things to a certain degree. And really, the issue with that is if they aren't well defined and if they're not in alignment, you're really leaving it up to the person who's being measured by those to always make that decision and be on that continuum between the two different conflicting metrics. It's more important for management to understand what's most important for their organization and to remove those conflicts so that they can drive the behavior that they're looking to within their organization. Because ultimately, metrics come down to alignment with the strategy and are really tools to help you drive towards that strategy.
Perfect. And are those some of the thoughts that were behind the metrics for action?
They are. As I said, all too often, I walk into manufacturing organizations and you find conflicting metrics and you find too many metrics within those manufacturing environments to where employees don't really know what's expected of them, right? There's so many metrics that they don't know which one to follow. Also, there's struggles within manufacturers to really understand how someone's day-to-day activities impact the overall organization. And that's really where the metrics tying out through the different levels of the organization is important. The other thing, we really wanted to highlight some key metrics that will allow users to drive flow and to drive synchronization in the organization. And what we found over and over again is if we align ourselves to flow and improve flow, all the other key performance indicators that manufacturers really care about flow in the right direction, whether it be increasing on-time customer service or increasing the number of inventory turns or, ultimately for manufacturers, increasing overall profitability. When we improve flow and we improve synchronization, we will see those things move in the right direction.
Terrific. So for our listeners, the metrics for action were introduced in 2016 as a means to provide demand-driven manufacturers with a streamlined set of performance-impacting operations metrics. And John, these are metrics that manufacturers can monitor to make quick improvements. Can you talk a little bit about the thinking behind this set of metrics and how they came about?
Yes, Pam. We really wanted to lay out for people the metrics that really align them to this concept of flow and synchronization. And one of the things I'd like to differentiate on here is the difference between metrics for action and metrics for analysis. There's plenty of things that you can look at to analyze how well your business is doing. There's a lot of financial analysis and other things that can let you know what areas you may want to take a closer look at within the organization. These need to be differentiated from metrics for action or performance metrics. And an important thing to note here is there's informal as well as formal metrics, right? So if you are asking your employee about a certain metric 3 times a month or multiple times a week, that is truly a measurement of their performance as far as they're concerned. So it's important to differentiate between what you're going to use for analysis and what you're going to use as an ongoing performance metric. For us, the performance metrics, as I mentioned before, it is about driving the behavior and driving the organization towards the strategy. For us, the strategy needs to be about demand-driven manufacturing. It needs to be about flow and synchronization. And really what we laid out here is metrics that are easy to follow for users. We've laid out the definition of them. It's a compact set of metrics, but really that is so that people have the appropriate focus and so that they can stick with those, understand them, understand how their day-to-day work impacts those metrics. And ultimately, the goal was to put in place metrics that would allow users to advance themselves down the path of demand-driven manufacturing.
Perfect. Thanks for the distinction between metrics that are for analysis and metrics that you can take action on. So if listeners want to learn more, Synchrono has a white paper that provides some additional background on the basis for these metrics, how they came about and how they relate back to the elements of demand-driven manufacturing, synchronization, and flow. So I pulled one of the metrics from the Metrics for Action guide. And this guide describes each metric, how it's measured, and provides suggested actions to take based on the measurement. Since we've talked about constraints throughout this series and the fact that this may be a new metric to many, John, I thought we could talk a little bit about constraints productivity. John, could you give us an overview of this metric and how you've worked with manufacturers to apply it?
Sure. A few things to know about the concept of constraint as far as how Synchrono and myself look at it. Constraints can be physical constraints within the operation, so physical resources that truly determine the overall productivity through the plant. So these are a limited number of resources that we're looking at to give us kind of the proxy for what the capacity of the overall plant is. In some of our customers or their environments, these are more like virtual constraints. They're really the definition of the pace that the organization has the capability of running at. So really, whether it's a physical constraint or whether we're just talking about kind of a virtual pace that the organization needs to run at, constrained productivity is all about understanding how much we need to be getting through the facility compared to how much we are getting through the facility. What we believe our capabilities are versus what our actual demonstrated productivity is. It's about taking into account the amount of throughput we expect to be going through the constraints compared to what we had planned to go through the constraints and making sure that that's in alignment. And again, since the constraints are the proxy for what the capabilities of the factory are, if we are producing what we expected on our constraints, then we're producing what we expected through our factories.
So here's another page from the Metrics for Action guide that describes the actions manufacturers can take based on the results of the constraints productivity metric. John, can you talk a little bit more about this metric from your direct experience working with it?
Sure, Pam. Often we will check in with our customers again after we've been working with them for a while to make them more demand driven. And oftentimes they'll have improved metrics and they'll want to know what it takes to get to that next level within their organization. And a key thing for them to start focusing on is, if they're talking to us about wanting to get their on-time delivery increased, they're talking about throughput level and where it's at and where it should be. This is really a metric that we turn to quickly to understand the constraint productivity, because then we can analyze it and say, well, according to the metrics, the constraint is producing at, let's say, 80% of what we expected to produce. And then we can start drilling down into why, what's causing that, and if it's an improvement event or something like that that needs to occur on the constraint, or if we have to recognize that that is the constraint's true capability, then the organization needs to decide how they're going to address that. Because if the constraint productivity is not high enough to meet up with demand, then either some process improvements need to be put into action, or we need to increase capacity in some way or outsource in order to meet the needs. Because it's really about, with constrained productivity, we always want moving in a northerly direction, right? We always want to be increasing throughput, but this is also a metric to see whether or not our facility is capable of keeping up with what the customers are requiring of us. And if we're in a situation where we're not, then the action is to make decisions around what needs to change within the environment so that we can service our customers.
Thanks. So typically, is it a process issue that you would address to improve this metric, or could it be other factors?
It really depends on the environment.
Okay.
Some environments, it's having policies that are contradictory. In some environments, it's that they're not getting enough support at that resource to continue to improve it. Sometimes it's how we have breaks laid out. Sometimes it's that they're not getting first billing when there's a maintenance issue that needs to be done on it. So there's a whole host of things that could be going on with the constraint resource. Some of the exciting things about the metrics for action is they really give us the core things to focus on.
Right.
So that these things can be highlighted quickly.
Right.
And so that we can focus our resources on resolving them.
And continuous improvement.
Yep.
So is the constraint always constant? Or, I would imagine in some environments, the constraint resource varies.
So you can definitely have more than one constraint in an environment, and through product mix, it might move. It never moves around as much as people in more of a traditional or push environment think that it does, because I'd like to differentiate between a bottleneck versus a constraint. You can have, due to releasing too much work in process to the shop floor, you can have wandering bottlenecks where it's kind of like a rat moving through a snake, right? Where there's a large queue of stuff, and that queue gets worked optimally at that resource, and it gets thrown over to the next resource, and it's kind of this wandering queue and wandering bottleneck. Really, once you become demand driven and start constraining that release to the shop floor, only what the shop floor can handle, then you really deplete those queues to only what needs to be out there, and your true constraints will become evident. So yes, you can have more than one. Yes, they might bounce around a little bit, but it's only a handful of resources as opposed to every resource within the factory.
All right, great. Thanks, John. Well, that wraps up this final installment of our series on the 5 key elements that drive flow. As we mentioned, there's a white paper and the Metrics for Action guide that are available at syncrono.com/resources that'll give you all kinds of information on the basis of these metrics and guidance on how to use them. Join us next time when we'll be talking about visualizing these metrics for action. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Pam. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.